Thank you. Okay, welcome everybody for our Wild in Bayside talk tonight. Just like to start with an acknowledgement of country. On behalf of Friends of Native Wildlife, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting. For many of us, that's the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We especially welcome any members of the Indigenous community here tonight. We acknowledge that we all share responsibility to nurture country and sustain it for future generations. We look forward to our shared future. So welcome everyone. I'm Paul Foxworthy. I'm Secretary of Friends of Native Wildlife. During tonight's presentation, you'll also be hearing from Sally, who's a committee member. She'll be managing the questions. We'll say more about that in a moment. And we also have Anne, who's President of Friends of Native Wildlife, and Adam, who's Treasurer, on the call tonight. So I'll just say a little bit about Friends of Native Wildlife. We're residents in and around the city of Bayside in Melbourne. We're working to conserve and learn about our local native flora and native fauna, I should say. We advocate for the conservation of wildlife in our region. We engage and educate our community for helping people understand our wildlife and take action. We research, survey, and monitor to learn more about our native wildlife and conservation needs. And we advise local land managers, local and state government, and other stakeholders. At the bottom of your screen, you might see a button labelled Q&A with two speech bubbles. If you can't see that, it might be hiding behind a button labelled either more or simply three dots, ... During Philippa's talk, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A list. If you like a question somebody else has asked and you'd like to hear an answer to that, you can upvote it by clicking on the thumbs up. Please do that so we'll try and get some idea about which questions are of most interest to everybody. We will do our best to get to questions, but it may be that we don't have time to answer everyone's questions. You're also welcome to use the chat in Zoom to communicate with each other, whatever comments you might like to make, but we're not going to be looking for questions for Philippa to try and answer in the chat. So please use the Q&A if there's a question that you'd like Philippa to say something about. So we're very lucky tonight to have Philippa Bell joining us. Philippa is a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne. She's researching how we might enhance nature strips and the urban environment in general to increase biodiversity and to protect our wildlife, including bees, beetles, butterflies, birds. So I'll ask Anne to put the spotlight on Philippa. And hi, Philippa, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully you can all see my PowerPoint now. Excellent. I'm going to move you all to the side. Unfortunately, I can't look at all of your lovely faces while I'm talking today, but we have a bit of time for that at the end. So thank you guys for inviting me along. I'm really excited to share some of my work with you today and to talk about the urban landscape, why I find it so interesting, and the many things that we can do to help out animals, plants, and just the environment, you know, in our own backyards, front yards, and on our roads. So I'm going to present to you today one portion of my research, which is building streetscape habitat to enrich biodiversity. Like Paul said, I'm a second year PhD student at the University of Melbourne, and I work in the Urban Biodiversity, Ecology and Conservation Lab. And before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land where I work, learn and live, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the academy, especially in the ecological sciences. So a bit of background on what I do. So in urban ecology, we're concerned with the study of organisms and how they persist, use, take advantage of, or are excluded by the urban environment. And increasingly, we're looking at bringing conservation action into the urban landscape, into the places where people work and live, because of many, many factors that I will tell you guys in a moment. So I'm really lucky that during my PhD, I get to spend a lot of time outside. I do a lot of taking photos of bugs. All of these photos here are mine. One of the great perks about doing my field work out in Brunswick is that I get to, stop for coffee whenever I like. People walk their dogs by, people stop and they chat. And it's a really great way to get sort of the message out. Another way that I do a lot of outreach stuff is by going to conferences. This is a picture of me earlier this year in Darwin at the Ecological Society of Australia conference, where I presented a poster on the research that I'm talking to you guys about today. And I just wanted to acknowledge as well that the work that I will present to you couldn't have been done without support from the Ecological Society of Australia and in-kind support from the City of Marybeck, where the research was done, and also support from the University of Melbourne. If you'd like to connect with me on the socials or get in touch in any way, my Twitter, LinkedIn, and my email are here, and we'll get started. So a bit of an outline of what I'm going to present for you guys today is, first of all, a background on the urban landscape and why it's so interesting and why we need to really be getting involved with it. I'm going to present to you some of my research and then take a look at the City of Bayside nature strip planting policies and discuss how you might put a garden on your own nature strip. So to get right into it, the urban landscape is growing. We have estimates that 68% of the population will live in the urban environment by 2050, and this will be accompanied by a 1.25 million square kilometre increase in urban area by 2030. And this will happen through a process called urbanisation, which is the conversion of rural land into urban land. And we know that this process is hugely detrimental to the natural environment. So if you consider here a natural environment, it's filled with shrubs, grasslands, trees, it's got river corridors, and it's just full of resources for all of the animals and the plants that are living there. When the process of urbanisation begins, we remove this habitat in favour for built infrastructure like roads and buildings. And this is taking resources out of the environment, resources that animals and plants need to use. And to kind of strip it back a bit, animals occupy what is known as their niche. And the niche is the set of living and non-living requirements that they need to live and to reproduce. So by taking resources out of the environment and removing them from these animals' niches, we're filtering animals out of the environment and reducing species richness. And with habitat loss comes habitat fragmentation. The remaining patches of habitat, so like these patches of trees and bushes and grasslands, are separated by roads, by tall buildings, and it makes it really difficult for animals to move between subpopulations. So this can impact population processes, and smaller and more isolated populations are at an increased risk of extinction, so further filtering some of those animals and organisms out of the environment. Lastly, we introduce lots of exotic plants for gardening and exotic animals because they're pets and they look pretty. And this can just further increase the pressure that we put on our native plants and animals. So the plants that we bring into our gardens, they can, escape from our gardens and become weedy and outcompete native flora, and that can have an impact on some of our animals that are highly specialized to use our native flora and really rely on those resources. And this all sounds absolutely awful. And we've spent a lot of time finding out all of the bad things about what happens to animals and plants in the urban landscape. But it's really time now to look towards how we can mitigate the effects of urbanization. So how we can start repairing the landscape and bringing conservation into the urban space. And so luckily, with the enormous size of the urban landscape and the amount of differences in all of the different areas of the landscape, there is so much opportunity for conservation action. For instance, we can value small and novel green spaces like parks, backyards, gardens, and road verges, and focus on building habitat in these areas. And there's been a lot of research showing that the cumulative benefit from all of these small patches of habitat is just as great, if not greater, than if we had one large offset area of habitat. We can prioritize these areas of habitat in a way to create corridors for dispersal to help animals move between subpopulations. And the urban area is already full of transport corridors that we can use to take advantage of this. Lastly, we can investigate creative solutions. So using artificial habitat like insect hotels and fake tree hollows to kind of improve the quality of the habitat that is around. And these sorts of things are already being implemented in parks and gardens with varying degrees of success for a lot of species. And speaking of urban spaces for conservation, well, the topic for today is nature strips, which is primarily what I am concerned about. And nature strips are an abundant and underutilized green space, with some estimates from Melbourne saying that they make up 33% of public green space. But there's no understory and there's few resources for animals that will rely on flowers and shrubs for nectar, pollen, and nesting habitat. And they are already positioned along transport corridors. So it's a huge area for habitat additions that lend themselves logically to developing green corridors throughout the urban landscape. Nature strips are council land that is privately maintained, so they're in this really kind of bizarre social space that we'll talk about a little bit later. But many councils already endorse nature strip plantings. So this is a huge area of land that we essentially have the green light to go ahead and start putting habitat in. What kind of species can we look at for urban conservation? Well, we can't just attract whatever we like. We can't have kangaroos jumping down the street. We can't have dingoes in people's backyards. So I'm primarily focused on insects. This is also because there are alarming rates of insect declines globally, with 30% of species declining and 1 in 3 species already endangered. This has been attributed to habitat loss, of which there is a lot in the urban landscape, as well as pollution, the use of pesticides, and climate change. And the loss of insects can threaten ecosystems. They form the basis of many ecosystem services like pollination and nutrient cycling, and they're also the base of a lot of food webs. So they're a very, very important food source for a lot of animals. One of which that I'm also concerned with are birds. And the urban landscape does have a lot of birds in it, but it's dominated by mid-sized generalist birds. So we're thinking things like magpies, pigeons, cockatoos, birds that you probably saw out and about today. But there really isn't a lot of small and insectivorous birds, and that's because there's less insects, there's less habitat for them. They really rely on those shrubs to hide in. And they need to hide in them because these large generalist birds are bullies. They're big, big bullies, and they just drive these little birds out of the environment. So we look at species like superb fairy wrens because they're really charismatic. They're easy to identify when they are around. They're really, really cute. So they make good flagship species. So kind of that sort of species, or you say to people, you know, do this because it'll help the superb fairy wrens, even though you're actually hiding insects in there as well, but not everybody cares about the insects. And these sorts of species are linked with insects through predator-prey interactions, which is why I'm also very interested at looking at them. We have evidence that both of these groups benefit from high diversity understory vegetation. So in studies of parks, golf courses, and cemeteries, authors have repeatedly found that where there is a higher diversity of understory vegetation, so thinking grasses, wildflowers, and shrubs, there is an increased diversity of insects and small birds. So there's substantial opportunity for conservation on nature strips through the addition of understory vegetation, and that's what I would like to do. But nature strips are a human space. We use them for lots of things. There's utilities, we put our bins there, we park our cars there. So it's important to remember that the urban landscape is a human-dominated landscape. But we do need to be taking advantage of urban space for nature. It's important for people as well. As people move into urban areas, opportunities for nature interactions are becoming scarce. And we call this the extinction of experience. So the extinction of human nature interactions, being out in nature and experiencing nature, which I'll go into a little bit more because there are implications for both nature and people. So people are biophilic and we benefit from being in nature, and this is reflected in our physiology. We have studies that indicate that people who live in areas with a higher proportion of green around them have improved general health or perception of their general health. In neighbourhoods with a higher amount of green space, there's also a lower prevalence of depression and anxiety, among other disorders. And there are community level benefits. Communities that garden together or go out in nature together, go walking together, have improved social cohesion and also participate in more sustainable behaviours. And then on the flip side of this, interaction with nature is required to create sensitivity to the environment. And this is especially true of children, but you know, any person is not going to be interested in what they don't see and is not going to care about what they don't see. And Robert Pyle, who is a writer and lepidopteran, a butterfly researcher, put it as, what is the extinction of the condor to a child who has never known a wren? Which is something to think about. Gardening, for instance, can provide opportunities for positive nature interactions. And this study in particular found that people who gardened more frequently were more likely to view insects as beneficial animals in their garden and less likely to view them as disgusting or scary or nasty. And similarly, this study found that people who spend more time in urban parks, especially ones that were more forested or resembled more remnant vegetation, were more likely to become invested in ecological restoration works and other actions which promoted an overall sense of ownership and stewardship. So these people who are spending more time in nature care more about nature. And that's really, really important when we're trying to put conservation action in the urban landscape. And the takeaway message here is that conservation action in the urban landscape can benefit both people and nature. So this brings me to my own research aims. So I focus on assessing the value of nature strips for insects and insectivorous bird conservation in cities, and also investigating human attitudes and perspectives towards conservation on nature strips. So I'm interested in what we can do on nature strips that is important from an ecological perspective, And then how can we do that in a way that benefits people as much as it benefits nature? Brings me to my third research aim, which is to develop evidence-based guidelines for effective habitat additions on road verges for people and nature. So the study that I'm going to present for you today is Building Streetscape Habitat to Enrich Biodiversity, which is an experiment that I'm in the midst of at the moment. It's kind of forming the largest part of my thesis. There's lots of other things that are going on around it, but this is really the on-the-ground action research that I'm really excited to tell people about. And a little bit more rationale. So nature strips are abundant and underutilized and provide few resources to urban animals. So I'm interested to see, can nature strips be effectively retrofitted for biodiversity? And also ask how urban animals respond to habitat additions on this scale. This is a brief overview of my own experimental design, which you guys don't really need to know about, but I'd love to tell you what I've done. So I started maybe May last year, scoping out nature strips in the city of Marybeck, looking primarily at Brunswick, Coburg and Fawkner in streets that are near the Merry Creek, and sort of using the Merry Creek as a source population for animals that I wanted to attract into the streetscapes. And I identified 28 nature strips to be included in this study. And from November to February, just been, I went out to each nature strip 4 times and I surveyed it for insects and for birds. And after doing that in March, that's just been, 14 of those nature strips were designated as controls. So I didn't do anything to them. They remain as lawn and a street tree. And the other 14 nature strips became these impact sites. And I tore them up and I planted lots and lots of native plants, about 1,500 native plants all up. And they're out that way, busy growing and enjoying the sunshine and hopefully getting watered and weeded by the people who agreed to be a part of the study. But this November and February, I will survey all of these nature strips again, another 4 times, and I'll then be able to compare the difference before and after the intervention. And I can also compare the difference between the impact and the control sites. So this is called a before-after control impact study, and it's a very robust way of seeing if an intervention has had the impact that I'm hoping it has. So the nature strips started off with this lawn and a street tree, which you're probably very familiar with. It's sort of like the default nature strip around Melbourne. And 2 of the metrics that I'm particularly interested in and are particularly relevant for insects and small birds are structural variation and species diversity. So with the structural variation, we're seeing that there's the canopy of the tree and there's the flat lawn underneath, but there's absolutely nothing going on in the middle. There's no understory, there's no shrubby mid-story. So this is considered low structural variation. Similarly, with the species diversity, there is the tree. There's generally 1 tree on the nature strip, so that's 1 species. And there's the lawn underneath. And lawn isn't inherently a bad thing for biodiversity. It's really more about how we maintain that lawn. If you let your lawn, get some weeds in it, get some dandelions and some clover, what else is good? Some English daisies, and you let those flowers grow up and you let them bloom, there's going to be heaps of bees and heaps of butterflies in there. They do love that. But the issue comes when we start maintaining the lawn within an inch of its life, and it's that thick green carpet that not even beetles can dig through. And that is then considered what we call a monoculture. So effectively, it's like 1 individual, 1 species. So nature strips, as they are like this, are a pretty low species diversity. And essentially what's happening here is that we don't have any of those resources that our pollinators and our little birds need in the environment. So my goal here is to increase structural variation by planting ground covers, grasses, wildflowers, and shrubs, and to increase species diversity with all of those plants as well. I think I planted either 11 or 12 species of plants. I can't actually remember off the top of my head, but it's a substantial increase in species diversity. And just briefly, I surveyed insects and birds on 4 occasions. I focused primarily on bees, beetles, and butterflies for insects because of their important roles in pollination and in nutrient cycling. And I surveyed them by essentially crawling around on the ground with a specimen jar and catching them individually. And this was great because it made it really easy to count them. I'm not sure if you've stood and looked at a patch of grass and tried to count all the bees on the dandelions before, but it's very difficult. So catching them all individually was helpful with that. It also helped me identify some of the species that are difficult to tell what they are just when they're flying around. I did also make a point not to kill any of these insects. Common survey methods for insects will take a net, and they'll net an area and then drop it all in ethanol or in water with detergent. So all of those insects die. That does make them a lot easier to identify, but I'm assuming that insects in the urban environment might have a lot of pressures on them, and I don't really want to contribute to those pressures, so I did let all of my insects go. The bird surveys were absolutely lovely. I just got to sit out in the sun all spring and summer and eat my lunch and look at birds. And for both the insects and the birds, I counted the number of individuals, I recorded the species that they were, and something that was really important to record was their resource use. So if they were collecting pollen, or if they were perching, or if they were eating food, and what plants they were doing that on, because that will help inform some of those decisions that we make a little bit further down the track. So there's a lot of things in that study that I've kind of glossed over because it was applicable to guidelines in the city of Marybeck, but not necessarily applicable to guidelines of the city of Bayside. So I'm just going to go through some photos of some bugs and I will get to the city of Bayside policies. To help with insect identification, I took a macro camera, and I took photos of some of the bugs so I could later identify them on my computer. So this is just a little handful of some of the bugs I was lucky to see, and some of the bugs you guys might be lucky to see if you go out and have a look around. So this one here is a scarab beetle. It's in the June bug family. Unfortunately, I didn't find any Christmas beetles last year, but if you guys are out and about and you see big green or yellow super shiny scarab beetles, take a photo of them and put them on iNat, and it will contribute to a really, really fantastic citizen science project, which is looking at finding where all the Christmas beetles have gone. This guy here is a flat bark beetle, named so for pretty obvious reasons. When I picked it up, I thought I had squished it, but it actually is just that flat. I've never seen a bug that is so incredibly two-dimensional. And these guys here are rove beetles, and they're pretty scary looking. They've got these big mandibles. They've got these really scary looking hairs on them. And they're a bit difficult to identify as beetles because they've got really, really short wings. But one of the key identifiers for beetles is the hardened outer wing, which is called elytra, and that protects their soft flying wings when they're crawling through bark or digging in the ground. Some bees and wasps that I found. I didn't even know about these bees until I started doing this research. I knew that we had a lot of native bees in Australia. I kind of knew about the blue-banded bee and some of the carpenter bees, but these Lasioglossums and Homolyctus species are really dominating the native bee game out on nature strips. But you just wouldn't know about them unless you stopped to kind of take a look. So one thing that this study has really taught me is that there is just a really intricate, very expansive world of tiny, tiny bugs that we just don't notice on a daily basis unless you slow down, you go out on a sunny day and you go and look at some flowers, and then you'll find just an incredible diversity of little animals. If you're not paying enough attention, all of these essentially look like houseflies. But if you stop and you take a look, you'll see that the little native bees are all covered in pollen. And these little native wasps that look pretty similar, they're not covered in pollen. And the way they fly around is just so incredibly different to bees and flies when you stop and take a look at them. They have their antenna. These guys are predators, so they've got their antenna out and they're just walking around, kind of popping their antenna on the ground, having a sniff at everything, trying to find the next prey. So they are a lot of fun to sit and watch if you have the time. And lastly, these are some of the moths that I've photographed. This is a green blotched moth, and this is an Australian magpie moth. These guys are all sorts of different varieties of grass moths and bark moths and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of my butterflies because butterflies are probably one of the easiest things to identify. So I don't have to catch them and take photos of them all the time. But I was impressed with how many moths were just out and about during the day and how many of them rely on kind of long bushy grasses to roost in during the day. The results of this study are coming next year. It's not finished yet. I'm really sorry to tell you guys, but the preliminary data that I have gathered from a previous study is looking very, very promising. So I'm doing this research because nobody has done it before. So I can't come out and tell you that planting your nature strip will increase biodiversity, but there is a lot of evidence to say that planting a garden on your nature strip might it's very much likely to increase biodiversity, and there is some data coming very soon to support that. But that is enough about me for the time being. I'd like to talk about what you guys can do and what's possible on your nature strip. If you've got a nature strip that looks like this, but you want to turn it into this, how might you do that? And just to touch on briefly why plant your nature strip, for myself and for other urban ecologists, that is a very simple answer. And I'm hoping that I've already given you a lot of reasons why you might want to plant your nature strip. So other than the reasons that I've already mentioned, but it's always best to assume that not everybody has the same level of knowledge. Maybe you didn't know you could do this. Not everybody has the same resources and not everybody has the same goals. It was tough to acknowledge, but I know that not everybody cares about bugs. I'm here to tell you that you should care about bugs, but I understand if you don't. So this is the more practical list of why people do or don't plant their nature strips. And this was a study in Perth, and they surveyed 91 people who adopted a verge planting program, which was run by a local council over there. And they also surveyed 71 people who did not partake in this program. Of the people who planted their nature strips, 77% did it just for aesthetics. So they're taking advantage of that space. Maybe they were keen gardeners to start off with and they'd gotten bored of their back and their front yard. They wanted more space on their nature strip. 53% did it to reduce their water use. Water is something that is very important to all of us, and we've all, had to deal with lack of water before. And if you're in a hot, arid area during summer but want your garden to look fantastic, if it's just filled with lawn, you're going to have to use a lot more water than if you had indigenous drought-resistant plants everywhere. And only 50% of them did it because it was good for the environment. But that's okay. Of the non-verge planters, 33% didn't plant a garden because they didn't know about the program. So that's really important for us as urban ecologists, is just to arm people with the knowledge on how to do this and to provide people with the tools and to get the word out that there's lots of little things you can do as individuals to contribute to the greater whole. 23% use the space for something else, which is absolutely understandable. They might park their car there. They might park their caravan there. We are tight for space. And 22% didn't have enough time. Though I will go on to argue that having an established native garden that you only have to prune 4 times a year is going to save you more time than having to go out and mow your lawn every 6 or 8 weeks. But this is the gist of the City of Bayside Nature Strip guidelines. If any of you guys are out of the City of Bayside, your council will likely have a page up on nature strip guidelines. If they don't, ring someone, hound someone, see if you can do it, see if you can get involved. But the rest of the information that I'll be presenting is specifically on the City of Bayside. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind. Like I said, you know, nature strips are a human space and they're a utility space as well. So there's a few things that we need to consider to maintain safety and utility on your nature strips. So where can't you plant? There's a minimum of 1.5 meters that must be kept clear from the property boundary. My understanding is that will comprise all of the footpath and maybe a little bit of your nature strip. So it's best not to let plants grow over this or lean over this. People need to get past with their prams, with pushers and things like that. There's also a minimum of 0.5 meter clearance from the back of the curb, and this is for vehicle access and for bin collection. So people need to be getting in and out of their cars. We need to put our bins there as well. So you need to keep that free. So that leaves you with this planting zone in the middle of your nature strip here, which, depending on how big your nature strip is, could be quite a substantial space or it could be a really small space. So it's about kind of having creativity and flexibility to do what you want within that space. And the plants that are there must be no higher than 0.6 meters, and that's to maintain sight lines for cars coming in and out of driveways. So it's, of course, very important to maintain safety around these spaces. So you've decided that you want to plant your nature strip. How are you going to start that? I'm going to present to you guys today solarizing, which is a method of killing existing lawns and weeds. And you do this in late summer when the sun is really hot and really beating down on the ground. You wet the area and cover with black plastic, tarp, or a cardboard. You leave it for 4 to 6 weeks, and essentially what it does is just bake everything that's going on underneath. After that, you'll have to manually remove the top layer of lawn and soil. I recommend about 10 centimeters to get rid of the dead grass and the seed bank underneath. The advantages here are that you don't need to use any chemicals and it's cheap. And the disadvantages are that it's a long process and it looks a little bit gross. But while your solarizing is taking place, you can do other things to prepare for planting. Ideally, you want to plant in autumn, so starting your solarizing in late summer lines you up really nicely for that. You're going to plant into a layer of mulch. The City of Bayside says that you need to use pine or hardwood, 12 to 25 millimeters in size. Plan your garden in advance, know where everything's going to go, consider the location of your bins and the street tree. If you need any special access needs for cars, and also look at your planting palette, which I'll talk about in a second. You'll also want to look at dial before you dig to know where all of the utilities are under your nature strip. But if you're digging just by hand with a shovel, this should not be an issue for you. Briefly, some of the prohibited items are synthetic turf, letterboxes, irrigation, rocks, and anything that obstructs sightlines. But all of this information is in the City of Bayside planting guidelines. When considering planting pallets, it's important to know that Australian fauna have co-evolved with native plants for many years, and they form significant and sometimes specialised relationships with host plants. There are lots of resources for you out there, including powerful pollinators and the City of Melbourne Urban Nature Planting Guide, which I highly recommend. Now, I'm seeing that we're just a touch short on time. I may have rambled just a touch too much. This is the City of Bayside planting palette. They provide some really good recommendations for ground covers, grasses, and small shrubs. I've pulled for you just these 8 out, 2 of kind of each structural variety. And using the City of Melbourne Urban Nature Planting Guide, I was able to find that each of these plants is highly associated with a certain family of insect or bird. So the common correa is really attractive to our yellow-faced bees. The cushion bush and the common everlasting are both really attractive to our laceoglossum bees, which are those small black ones that I mentioned earlier. The stork's bill are a larval food plant for many moths, and so that's that these moths like to lay their eggs on these plants so the caterpillars can eat them. And where we have lots of caterpillars on plants, we also have lots of caterpillar-eating birds that are attracted to them. The black anther flax lily is a really special one. It's a Dianella species, and all of the Dianella are really closely associated with our blue-banded bees. That's for a lot of reasons that I won't go into, but the blue-banded bees do what's called buzz pollination. So rather than visiting one flower to collect nectar and pollen and then going to another flower and pollinating, they'll grab onto a flower and they'll buzz really hard and they release all this pollen into the air. So that's able to be distributed to more flowers more effectively. The tussock grasses are a larval food plant for little blue butterflies, and those dried grasses in and amongst the nice greeny leafy stuff are a really important material for bird nests. So it's always great to remember that there are dead resources that animals will use from these plants. The nodding saltbush is covered in these nice little red berries that's very attractive to fruit and seed eating birds. And the running postman is attractive to our megachillid bees, which is another really interesting family of native bees. So even with just these 8 species, there's an extraordinary amount of insect and bird diversity that is associated with these plants. And you've got 2 shrubs, 2 wildflowers, 2 grasses, and 2 ground covers to make up all of that structural variation as well. In terms of maintenance, prune your plants after flowering to encourage bushy growth. So this is once per season. And prune plants when needed to maintain sight lines and to keep driveways and footpaths clear. So this is pruning essentially 4 times a year. Weeding will be as needed. If the solarizing has worked well for you, then you shouldn't need to do too much weeding. And as those plants grow and mature and they completely cover the ground, there'll be less space for weeds to come in anyway. And watering will be important during autumn when the plants are establishing, and also during summer when there are particularly dry spells. Most of these plants, though, especially the indigenous ones, should be drought resistant when mature. So lastly, just some take-home messages. Urban animals face a lot of pressures, but there's value in small and novel green spaces. And it's just really important to remember that doing something is always better than doing nothing. Data on the value of nature strip plantings is coming soon, but so far it's looking really promising. And planting a garden on your nature strip is a practical way of contributing to biodiversity in your neighbourhood. It's also good for you. It's great to get out. It's a fantastic social experience with your neighbours. They might provide resources for you. They might have really good knowledge for you as well. Here are some useful resources. You'll need to look at the City of Bayside, How to Plant Your Nature Strip, and the City of Melbourne Urban Nature Planting Guide and Create a Biodiverse Streetscape are also really good resources. You can also follow me on Twitter if you want to learn a little bit more about where the research goes. Thank you, everybody. I'm happy to take some questions. Would you like me to stop sharing my screen, Paul, so we can see everybody as a group?
That's probably a good idea, yes, Philippa. Okay.
All right. So how did we want to do the Q&A?
All right, so I'll just the first one here is, do you do any surveying of nocturnal insects using methods such as moth sheets and lights?
No, I don't. I would love to. It would be very, very interesting to take a look at. For a PhD, I'm pretty limited on time, so I had to make very conscious decisions about what insects I was and wasn't going to look at. I also had to make some very conscious decisions about the survey methods. So with the light traps, and with other methods where the design is to attract the insects to you, I thought that that would undermine the actual value of the nature strip plantings, because I'll start to say, well, are the insects coming here because there's flowers and resources for them? Or are they coming here because I'm shining this big bright light, or I'm putting out UV traps for bees and things like that? So not at this point in time, but it would certainly be something interesting down the track.
Okay. Do you want to run with these, Sally?
Okay, yeah, I'm online now. Okay. So one of our questions is, does the solarizing process have any impact on soil biota?
It's likely that it does, but all of the methods will. And solarizing and using heat is going to be better in the long run than applying heaps of chemicals. And I struggled with this a little bit because I had a little boy who lives at one of the houses where I've put in these nature strips. And he came out with me one day and we found bugs on his nature strips. And then his mum sent me an email saying that he was really upset, asking what was going to happen to those bugs after the nature strip got dug up. And kind of just have to stop and think about, there might be an impact to biota to start off with, but in the long run, we're introducing more diversity with the plants, and it's a little bit of loss for a bigger gain in the future.
Yeah, that often seems to happen with conservation and restoration. There needs to be a bit of disturbance first, doesn't there? Okay. So, and I know you were talking about your time restraints with your study there. So is it likely that you'll be able to go back to your nature strips after 12 months, or?
Yeah, I would really like to. There is the possibility at the moment to do another 12 months. I think it would be really important to do that if I found after this first season that there was no impact from the nature strip plantings. That could be because the plants haven't gotten big enough yet, or there hasn't been enough time for insects and birds to actually recognize that there's more habitat there. So it would be really important to go back another year after that to see if there has been that difference over time. And depending on what happens after my PhD, it could be an ongoing thing.
Right. So do you happen to know around Melbourne which councils seem to be the most advanced in this area and have the most nature strips that are converted?
Don't know off the top of my head. The city of Marybeck is pretty good because they've had their nature strip guidelines for a very long time. So there are some very old and established plantings around there. The city of Port Phillip was involved in the Heart Gardens project, which you guys might have heard about. It made the news last year, and that was a project that was actually able to influence council policy and allow for more freedom with nature strip gardening. The city of Bayside ones are pretty good. They have a fair amount of leniency in them. That's something that I want to look more into when I do a social study and see how council policies are influencing people's decisions to garden or not to garden. But I haven't quite made it too far through all of the council policies yet.
Right. And let's see, what else have we got? One question I had was, how did you get your survey participants?
So I started off with a Facebook post inviting people to volunteer their nature strip. I then looked at all of the locations where people had volunteered because the sites have to be sufficiently spaced apart from one another to be called independent, which is very important for the study design. And then to fill in a couple of gaps, I went around and did some letterbox drops and again invited people to volunteer their nature strip and ended up getting a lot of responses, but had to pick and choose based on location and ended up with those 14. And all of these people are really enthusiastic about gardening and they're happy to maintain that nature strip into the future, which was something that was very important for the council. But yeah, a lot of these people said that they wanted to be involved because they loved gardening or because they loved the environment. One said that he just didn't want to mow his lawn anymore. So there was lots of reasons that people got involved.
Right. And I think there's a practical question about here is whether people need to negotiate with their neighbours.
So I would definitely recommend having a chat with your neighbour because you don't want them to like turn around and, you know, ask what you're doing and things like that. So certainly chat with your neighbour, let them know that that's something you're interested in doing. They might be interested in extending that garden further onto their nature strip if you share the one piece of nature strip. There's lots of different things that people do with their neighbours and their nature strips. There's one person who I spoke to who's part of my study, and he used to mow essentially like 5 or 6 houses worth of nature strips. And he then decided that he wanted to put a garden on his and he didn't want to mow any of his neighbours' nature strips anymore, and caused a bit of kerfuffle in the street because they had to figure out who was going to mow everybody's nature strips. So have a chat, see if you can, you know, just make sure that you're on the same page about it. And I can't foresee there being heaps of issues, but I mean, it depends on what sort of relationship you have with your neighbour. I don't think they should be able to stop you from doing it though, especially if you let the council know that you're doing it first.
Yeah, okay. Now, did you use any other habitat features such as logs in your nature strip upgrade?
I really wanted to have an additional treatment that included logs as well, for what we call saprophilic insects, which are insects that either feed on dead wood or burrow into wood or lay their eggs in wood. That was something that I was very interested to see if it had an impact, but I didn't get enough. I didn't have enough space or enough participants to add another treatment group. All of my nature strips do have mulch on them, and people can put little logs on there if they want to like establish paths. But unfortunately, it's not something that I'm going to be able to measure as robustly as I would have liked to.
Mm-hmm.
Highly
And
recommend.
oh, sorry. Do you find that the councils tend to support logs or not? I noticed that the Bayside guidelines don't like stones or rocks.
Yeah, it really depends on the council and how proactive or reactive they are in enforcing those local laws. So in the city of Marybeck, I work very closely with their conservation programs officer there. And she has said that the participants are allowed to put logs and pavers, appropriately. And the council's not going to do anything about it unless somebody complains about it, then they have to take action. So it really does depend on the council. I'm not really in a position to tell you to go ahead with it. But if you wanted to talk to anybody at council about it, I'm sure they'd appreciate chatting with you about it rather than having to launch an investigation and come door knocking to ask you to take them off. So have a chat, see if you're allowed to do it. Pavers are good for establishing pathways through the garden, especially if you always park your car there and you want to walk in and out of your car. But I'd double check with somebody who has a little bit more authority than me first.
We've had one comment here that Mornington Peninsula Shire doesn't like rocks or logs. So, oh, well, there you go. I'm obviously going against their guidelines because I've got heaps of logs on my nature strip. Okay. So, what else have we got here? Do you happen to know whether it's been a popular activity in Bayside, the converting nature strips?
I'm not sure really. Haven't driven around the burbs in Bayside personally for a little while.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I had an interesting impact. I think I grew some long grasses and I had a little water bowl out there and I got a couple of ducks come in for a rest. And so I thought that was really nice. I haven't seen that before.
That's really sweet. How surprising.
It was great. And we've also got a question, what can be placed on the 0.5 metre roadside space to keep weeds at bay and still make it functional?
Most people will probably just put mulch there. You can get native grasses that if you plant them in a high enough density, they tend to function a little bit more like a lawn and will handle being stepped on and being mowed or whippersnipped. I think there's a species of kangaroo grass, if you keep it short enough, will do that. If you look up native grasses as lawn, you'll be able to find some suggestions if you want to keep it a bit more functional than just having mulch.
Yeah, right. Okay. We've had a question, where did you get your plants from?
I got some of my plants from Western Plains Flora, which is an Indigenous nursery out in Sunbury, but they only do wholesale purchases. I got the rest of my plants from Kuranga Nursery in Mount Evelyn because I was looking for some cultivars that would be more appropriate for nature strips, a little bit shorter, a little bit more robust. The list of plants that's provided by the City of Bayside are all available at the Bayside Community Nursery. So that's who they recommend.
Just with the matter of water bowls, what are your thoughts on those?
I don't see any issue with having water bowls if that's something that's allowed by the council. You might want to consider putting like a layer of river rocks in them so they're not particularly deep. If there's some little rocks kind of poking up out of the surface, that'll be good space for insects to come and land on the rocks and then drink the water. Because if you've just got like a full bowl, like with really deep water, some insects can get trapped in there. The birds are going to love it though. So yeah, I think a water bowl, if you're allowed one, would be a great addition.
Mm-hmm. Do you think people need much encouragement to leave water out, for example, in summer for the wildlife?
Yeah, probably a bit. I'd imagine that there'd be some people who could think that it could attract animals that they don't necessarily want, like snakes, because they need to drink as well. So if you had a raised water bowl, if you were hoping just to attract birds and insects, that would work. I think with these things and with a lot of conservation issues, it's not necessarily that people are actively not participating. It's that people, and I'm talking about like the general public, obviously everybody here has some sort of interest already. It's just that people kind of don't know that you can do all of these things and don't know that it might have a really good benefit.
So do you think perhaps councils should put the word out and encourage people to do it?
Yeah, I think councils play a really important role, but you know, different councils have different priorities. I'm really excited to see that there's the conservation programs officer in the city of Marybeck, and she does a really, really cool work in the community with community groups, with schools and that sort of thing. But you guys are playing an absolutely important role in all of this as well.
Right, yeah. Okay, well, we've currently got draft urban forest precinct plans out for public consultation, and I noticed that there isn't really much talk about what the community can do on their nature strips in this whole strategy. So it might be something that could be looked at as part of that.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Any more questions? One was about, does the solarization work on kikuyu grass?
Yes, it should do. The grasses that we plant as lawn are notoriously hardy and difficult to get rid of. I haven't seen anybody say that solarization is specifically for kikuyu or for buffalo or for cooch. It's kind of just a general method that's used for lawn and other spaces. So I would certainly hope, and I haven't heard anybody say that it doesn't work on kikuyu grass.
Right, terrific. Okay, well, all the other comments are very complimentary, Philippa. And so thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It was really good opportunity to get the word out, and it's nice seeing you guys say that you like bugs.
Thank you very much, Philippa. Do keep your eye on your email. We're going to be sending you a little thank you present, but thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you very much, guys. Thanks for having me. It was a joy.
And just for all the attendees, so there was one question just asking about a video. So Philippa has agreed we're recording this presentation, and we will send a message to everyone who signed on for the meeting tonight to let you know when it's available on our YouTube channel. So that is coming. Thank you for that, Philippa. And the other thing we'd like to do is put out a survey just to ask you whether you'd prefer to have online presentations like this one or face-to-face. So we'll just ask the question from you. We'd be guided a lot by what people have to say on that. So keep your eye on the email. We'll send you a survey on that sometime soon as well. So thank you all for coming, everybody. Thank you again to Philippa. If you signed on for the meeting tonight, you will be getting our newsletter every 2 or 3 months with other events similar to this and other things that we do. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you, everybody, and good night.